Richard Ainsworth had once ruled boardrooms with the mere lift of an eyebrow. Billionaire, tech mogul, household name. His signature could shift markets. His decisions changed lives. But now, all that power seemed distant, almost absurd, as he sat silently in his wheelchair, staring at the rain sliding down the glass walls of his penthouse in Chelsea. The accident had happened 8 months ago. A helicopter crash, mechanical failure, the pilot claimed. Richard didn't remember much. Just the sound of metal shrieking, the sky spinning, and then nothing. When he woke up, he was paralyzed from the waist down. The doctor said it could have been worse. He didn't see it that way. Since then, he had fired every therapist, nurse, and assistant who dared to tell him it takes time. He didn't believe in time. Time was a currency he once controlled. Now it mocked him, stretching endlessly in silent rooms, untouched meals, and the echo of his own bitterness. His brother Jonathan was the only one who still visited regularly. "You're not dead, Richard," he said, standing awkwardly in the living room with his umbrella dripping on the marble floor. "You just stopped living." Richard didn't reply. He rarely did anymore. "I booked the staff to open up the Yorkshire estate. Go there. Get out of this bloody mausoleum. Breathe fresh air." "I don't need sheep and mud to feel alive," Richard muttered. "You need something," Jonathan said. "Because this isn't you. It's a ghost with your name." It was true. Richard Ainsworth, who once sat at the head of every table, was now a prisoner of his own pride, and he hated everyone who tried to save him. But a week later, he found himself in the back seat of a black Range Rover, winding through the damp roads of North Yorkshire. Not because he wanted to, but because saying no had become exhausting. The estate hadn't changed. Still sprawling, still stately, still smug. Stone walls, ivy-covered arches, the scent of wet earth. The silence felt different here, less like isolation, more like stillness. "Mr. Ainsworth," said the housekeeper as she opened the front door. "Welcome home." He didn't respond. He never liked that word. Home. The staff was reduced, just the essentials. Cook, groundskeeper, cleaner. A woman named Grace handled the domestic duties. "Efficient," Jonathan had said, "and discreet." Richard wheeled himself into the drawing room. Dust sheets had been pulled back, but the place still smelled of old memories and polished wood. He hated it instantly. He glanced out the window and saw a boy, maybe 10 or 11, sitting near the garden, sketching something with a twig in the dirt, barefoot, dirty jeans, peaceful. Their eyes met for a split second. The boy didn't look away. And for some reason Richard couldn't explain, that brief moment made him feel seen. He turned his chair sharply and wheeled away. He didn't come here to make friends, he came here to survive in silence. Richard had only been at the estate for 2 days, and already he was counting the hours until he could leave. The countryside was oppressively quiet. No sirens, no humming traffic, not even the familiar clack of office shoes against concrete. Just birds, wind, and the occasional sheep braying somewhere in the distance. The house, though grand, felt too large now. Empty corridors stretched like reminders of everything he had lost. Mobility, control, purpose. He refused to go upstairs, though a lift had been installed years ago. He stayed on the ground floor near the windows, as if proximity to the exit might somehow return his freedom. Grace, the housekeeper, worked quietly. She never tried to make conversation unless necessary, and for that Richard was grateful. She moved through the house like she belonged to it, calm, composed, with a kind of strength that didn't need recognition. And then there was the boy, Elliot. Richard saw him again that morning, crouched beside a small pond at the edge of the property, building something with sticks and pebbles. His clothes were worn, his trainers untied, and his hair a bit wild. But his hands moved with care, and his eyes were still. "Doesn't he go to school?" Richard asked, more to himself than to Grace, who happened to be passing by with a tray of tea. "Elliot's off this week," she replied. "Half-term break." Richard said nothing. He wasn't particularly interested in children. They were loud, needy, and had the annoying habit of asking questions that cut too close. Later that afternoon, the boy wandered closer to the main house. Richard sat in his usual spot near the window, reading the same page of a book he'd opened 3 times that day, but couldn't finish. When he looked up, Elliot was standing just outside the glass, holding a crumpled daisy. Richard blinked. The boy held up the flower, then gently placed it on the window ledge. Then he walked away. Richard stared at the daisy for a long time. He didn't open the window. He didn't move. But for some reason, he couldn't go back to his book either. The next day, Elliot was in the garden again, this time digging a small hole with a spoon. Richard wheeled himself out to the patio, the cold air biting his face. "What are you doing?" he asked, not kindly, just curiously. Elliot looked up. "Planting. With a spoon." "I don't have a spade," the boy said simply. Richard smirked. "And what do you expect to grow?" Elliot paused, then shrugged. "Hope? Maybe." The answer unsettled him. He had expected something childish, absurd. But there was no sarcasm in the boy's voice, no drama, just honesty. Back inside, Richard sat alone in the drawing room, staring at the daisy still resting on the windowsill. Hope. He scoffed aloud, but he didn't throw the flower away. The next morning, Richard woke up earlier than usual, not because he had anywhere to be, but because the silence had become too loud to ignore. Outside, the sky was a flat grey, the kind of English morning that made the world feel damp before it rained. He wheeled himself to the kitchen and found Grace chopping vegetables for soup. She greeted him with a polite nod and carried on. No small talk, no forced pleasantries, just rhythm and routine. He liked that about her. Out the window, the boy was at it again. This time, Elliot was crouched near the rose bushes, carefully trimming away dead petals with a pair of rusted scissors. He was talking to himself, or maybe to the flowers. Either way, he seemed completely content. "He likes it out there," Grace said, noticing Richard watching. "Says the plants are better listeners than people." Richard gave a dry chuckle. "He may be on to something." Grace hesitated. "He doesn't usually speak to strangers, but he left you a flower." "I noticed," Richard muttered. "Does he do that for all the grumpy guests?" Grace smirked but didn't answer. That afternoon, Richard went outside again, not far, just to the top of the patio steps. He parked his wheelchair beneath the overhang and watched as Elliot tugged at weeds near the fence line. "You know," Richard called out, "there's an easier way to do that." Elliot didn't look up. "Probably. But I'm used to doing things the hard way." Richard tilted his head. "You're a very philosophical 11-year-old. 12, the boy corrected, finally glancing his way. Almost 13. Still too young to be so serious." Elliot shrugged. "Grown-ups like to say that. But they're the ones who forget how to listen." There it was again, that strange, quiet confidence. Richard felt simultaneously irritated and impressed. He had built companies, managed hostile takeovers, stood in rooms with prime ministers and billionaires. Yet this boy with muddy shoes and skinned knees unsettled him more than any board meeting ever had. "You don't go to school?" Richard asked. "I do. I just learn more when I'm not there." "Is that so?" Elliot nodded. "You learn the wrong things in school sometimes, like how to stay quiet, how to fit in. I don't need help with that." Richard didn't know how to respond. He looked down at his lap. His fingers had started trembling again. He clenched them. "What do you want then?" he asked, almost without realizing. Elliot walked over, dirt on his hands, grass in his hair. He looked Richard straight in the eyes. "Truth and peace. Not just for me, for anyone who forgot how to breathe." Then he turned and walked away. Richard sat there, stunned, not by what the boy had said, but by how it had landed, like something sharp and necessary. That night, when Grace brought his dinner, he asked her something unexpected. "Could you get the boy a proper spade?" She smiled faintly, and for the first time, Richard didn't mind the silence that followed. It was raining again. the kind of steady, unrelenting drizzle that soaked you without drama. Richard sat by the wide bay window, watching water streak down the glass like tears he would never admit to owning. In front of him, on the low sill, the daisy Elliot had placed still hadn't wilted. Resilient, just like the boy. That afternoon, Grace served lunch late. She'd been helping Elliot build a makeshift greenhouse with leftover timber from the shed. Richard noticed how naturally she smiled when she spoke to her son, how different she seemed when not carrying trays or sweeping floors. When she left the room, Elliot wandered in, his trainers dripping with mud. "Don't touch anything," Richard warned automatically. "I wasn't going to," the boy replied, unfazed. "Just wanted to see what you read." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You can read?" Elliot didn't flinch. "Better than most adults. You?" That made Richard chuckle despite himself. "Touché." The boy wandered closer, peering at the book lying on Richard's lap. "Socrates. You know him? Greek philosopher. Said real wisdom is knowing you know nothing." Richard was genuinely surprised. "Where'd you learn that?" "The internet," Elliot said casually. "And from Grace. She reads a lot. She's a cleaner." "She's a woman," Elliot said flatly. "Not a job." For a second, Richard was silent. The boy's sharpness struck again, quick, unfiltered, yet never cruel. He studied Elliot, his small frame, the way he held himself, not defiant but grounded, like someone who had already seen more than a child should. "Tell me something, boy," Richard said, his voice sharper now. "You act like you're wise beyond your years, but you're still a child. What would you do if you were in my place? If your legs stopped working and your life turned to ash?" Elliot didn't hesitate. "I'd plant something." Richard scoffed. "And what would that solve?" "It wouldn't solve anything, but it would remind me I'm still here." Silence filled the space between them. Then, with a smirk, Richard leaned back. "You really think your words are going to cure me?" "No," Elliot said. "I think you're asking the wrong question." "Oh, really?" Richard folded his arms. "Fine. What do you want?" "My fortune. My companies. If you think I'm broken and desperate enough to hand over everything, say the word. I'll give you all I have." He said it sarcastically, eyes narrowing in challenge. Elliot stared at him. "I don't want your money," he said quietly. Richard laughed. "Then what do you want?" Elliot's eyes didn't waver. "Obedience." Richard's smirk faded. "Excuse me?" "You asked what I want, that's it. Not riches, not praise, just obedience." "To you?" "To life," Elliot replied. "To change. To what you know is right, but refuse to do." Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. The boy turned and walked out of the room. And for the first time since the crash, Richard felt the ground shift, not beneath his chair, but inside his chest. The word obedience echoed in Richard's mind long after Elliot had left the room. Obedience to life, to change. He had built an empire by commanding others, never by surrendering. That wasn't how the world worked. You gave orders or you were forgotten. But something about the boy's calm insistence unsettled him. The following morning was clear for once. Sunlight cut across the Yorkshire hills in soft golden waves. Richard wheeled himself to the back terrace and found Grace hanging laundry while humming an old folk tune. The breeze lifted the sheets like sails on a forgotten sea. Elliot was in the garden again, crouched over the patch where he'd planted something the week before, with that ridiculous spoon. "Still trying to grow hope?" Richard called out. Elliot looked over and grinned. "Hope takes time." Richard rolled his eyes but stayed. After a few minutes the boy approached, holding a small wooden box. He opened it carefully and held it out. "Seeds," he explained. "Tomatoes, carrots, basil. Want to help?" Richard blinked. "Help you garden." Elliot nodded. "You said you had nothing to do. I said I didn't want to do anything." "Same difference," Elliot said, shrugging. "I don't take orders from 12-year-olds. "Then don't think of them as orders." Richard stared at the box. "Fine," he said at last. "Give me something easy. Water the soil. No need to get your hands dirty. Richard nodded, wheeling himself closer to the edge of the path. Grace had left a watering can nearby, which he filled slowly from the rain barrel. He tipped it carefully over the small patch of dirt. "Not bad," Elliot said, inspecting his work, "but you missed a spot." Richard frowned. "Perfectionist." "No," Elliot replied. "Hope deserves effort." Richard couldn't argue with that. From that day on, a strange pattern formed. Each morning Elliot would bring a small task: hold the gate open for the chickens, refill the water trough, sort seeds, even take notes about which flowers were blooming. They were nothing grand, simple, even childish, but each one required attention and cooperation. Richard began to anticipate the boy's approach, not that he'd admit it. But when Elliot appeared with a task, something inside Richard shifted from passive resentment to reluctant curiosity. One afternoon, as they worked silently in the herb garden, Richard asked, "Why do you care if I help?" "I don't," Elliot said without looking up. "It's not about me, it's about you." "That's vague." "It's supposed to be," the boy said. "You're used to answers. Maybe it's time you lived the question." Richard didn't reply. Later that evening, Grace served dinner and found Richard unusually quiet. He didn't complain about the vegetables, didn't bark at the dog for barking. He even said, "Thank you," softly. Something was changing, not in his legs, but in the muscles he hadn't used in years, those of humility, patience, and something close to surrender. And it all started with a seed. The rain returned. Grey skies settled over the Yorkshire hills like a heavy wool blanket, draping everything in silence. Richard stayed indoors, watching the droplets race down the window panes like tiny messengers, delivering something he couldn't quite understand. He sat by the fireplace in the study, a leather-bound journal open in his lap, its pages still blank. Elliot had given it to him the day before, casually handing it over with a grin. "You've got a lot stuck in your head. Might be good to let some of it out," the boy had said, before running off to chase a wayward chicken. Richard didn't write. Not at first. Instead, he turned the pages one by one, brushing his fingers over the smooth paper. Memories stirred, uninvited, old ones, not of empires or investors, but of childhood summers long before the wealth, before the noise. He remembered this very house, the echoing halls, the cold breakfasts, the way his father always called him boy, never son. The discipline had been swift and unyielding. Manners were more important than emotions. Weakness was never tolerated. His mother, always poised, always silent, stood like a sculpture in every room, watching but never intervening. Richard closed his eyes. He remembered the time he cried after scraping his knee falling off a pony. His father had shouted, not because he was hurt, but because he'd shown pain in front of guests. That day, something in Richard had snapped into place, the understanding that to survive, he had to be harder than everyone else, stronger, colder, and eventually, richer. The fire crackled gently as he picked up the pen. "I don't know why I'm writing this," he scribbled. "Maybe because I can't say it out loud. Or maybe because a boy with dirt under his nails and a mind sharper than most told me to." He paused, then continued. "I used to think control was everything, that if I had enough money, enough power, I could insulate myself from pain. But it's still here, in the quiet, in the rain, in my bones." He didn't stop writing for an hour. When Grace brought his tea, she noticed the journal and raised an eyebrow. "Did Elliot give you that?" Richard nodded. "Smart lad," she murmured, placing the cup beside him. That night, Richard dreamt of a garden. Not the one outside, but a memory. A secret one. He was 6, hiding behind a hedge, watching a young gardener whistle while planting tulips. The man had noticed him, smiled, and let him plant a bulb with his tiny hands. "You've got to press gently," the man had said. "Even flowers don't grow if you force them." It was the first kindness Richard remembered receiving, and it had come from someone no one else noticed. He woke with a start. The morning light, peeked through the curtains. He reached for the journal and wrote, "I think I used to believe in kindness before I was taught to fear it." Outside, the garden waited. The days rolled on with a strange new rhythm. Richard, once ruled by meetings, deadlines, and phone calls that never stopped ringing, now found himself waking with the sound of birdsong and the quiet scrape of Elliot's spoon digging into the soil outside. The world was slower here, and oddly, it wasn't unbearable anymore. He still barked occasionally at the dog, at the faulty wheelchair ramp, even at the weather. But something inside him was softening, not by will, but by force of presence. The boy didn't try to change him. He just was, and that made all the difference. Grace continued to work with quiet grace. She never pried, never lingered, but always appeared just when needed, tea in hand, a hot meal, a clean shirt folded on the bed. She didn't expect praise. She certainly never asked for thanks. One morning, Richard noticed a tear on the sleeve of one of his favorite jumpers. "Grace," he said, holding it up, "this was expensive." Grace took the jumper gently and examined the fabric. "I can mend it." "Are you sure? It's cashmere." "I've mended worse," she replied, not offended in the least. Later that day, the jumper returned to his wardrobe, seamless, perfect. He stared at the sleeve for a long time. That evening over dinner, Richard made an effort. "You've been here a long time," he asked. "Almost 3 years. You could work anywhere. London hotels pay more." Grace shrugged. "They don't offer peace or time with Elliot." Richard looked at her, genuinely puzzled. "You chose this?" "I did." "But why? Surely you could—" "I didn't come here to chase something. I came to stay." Her words hit him in a place he didn't know was sore. Richard had always seen people as moving parts, helpers, assets, contracts. Not many stayed long. Even fewer stayed without being asked or paid heavily to do so. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself reflecting on the people he'd left behind. Lovers who hadn't lasted. Assistants who had burned out. Even Jonathan, his brother, always reaching out, always being pushed away. And yet Grace was still here. So was Elliot, not because of obligation, because they chose to be. The next morning, Richard was wheeling himself through the hallway when he heard music. A soft hum, Grace's voice coming from the kitchen. She was washing dishes, singing quietly to herself. Elliot sat at the table drawing, one foot tapping along to the rhythm. Richard lingered outside the doorway, unnoticed, watching the ordinary beauty of the scene. It struck him then. These two, living with so little, gave so much without asking for anything in return. No invoices, no conditions, just presence. For the first time, he wondered, what had he ever given without strings attached? That evening, when Grace served his tea, he said something that startled even himself. "Thank you for everything." She paused, then smiled. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the hardest thing to offer is staying." And Richard understood. Richard couldn't sleep that night. He stared at the ceiling for hours, the words Grace had spoken circling his mind. The hardest thing to offer is staying. He had spent decades making people leave, not with cruelty, but with coldness, with distance, with the unspoken understanding that everything had a cost. And yet, here was a woman staying, and a boy who gave without asking. He felt something stir, an urge he hadn't felt in years, the desire to give back. The next morning, Richard wheeled himself out to the garden, watching Elliot pull weeds near the herb bed. The boy looked tired, as if he'd grown overnight. "I've been thinking," Richard said. "That's dangerous," Elliot replied without turning. Richard smirked. "I want to offer you something. A real opportunity." Elliot sat up, brushing dirt from his hands. "Go on." "There's a private boarding school in Surrey. The best in the country. Science labs, music halls, scholarships to Oxford. I know the headmaster. I could get you in. Full tuition, everything paid." Elliot stared at him. Richard continued, trying to sound casual. "You're clearly bright. You could do something exceptional with the right education. Think about your future." But the boy didn't smile. His expression hardened. "Why would I want to leave?" Richard blinked. "Because it's the best path forward. It's what anyone would want." "No," Elliot said firmly. "It's what you would have wanted, because you think success only counts when you leave everything behind." "That's not what I meant." "Yes, it is," the boy snapped. "You think this place is small, unworthy, that I should run from it to prove I'm worth your help, but I never asked for anything." Richard's pride flared. "It's a gift." "No," Elliot said. "It's a trade. You're offering me something expensive so you don't have to feel what you're feeling." The silence between them thickened. "You're trying to buy your way out of feeling grateful," the boy said. "You always have. But I don't want your school. I don't want to leave. I want you to stay long enough to understand why people like us matter." Richard swallowed hard. His mouth opened, but no defense came. He had made a mistake. A generous one, perhaps, but still a mistake. He had tried to give in the only language he understood: money, status, opportunity. But Elliot didn't want elevation. He wanted recognition, respect. "I'm sorry," Richard said quietly. "I thought I was helping." "You can," Elliot replied, "but not with checks, with presence." He turned and walked away, shoulders tense. Richard sat in his chair, alone with the realization that sometimes the worst thing you can give someone is the version of success you never healed from. That evening, he didn't write in his journal. He just sat by the window, watching the garden, where a boy who had nothing had just taught him what real giving looked like. And this time, he listened. The next morning, Richard didn't come out of his room. Grace knocked softly twice, but received no response. His breakfast tray remained untouched. No sound came from the fireplace, no movement from his chair. The house, which had grown used to the rhythm of his slow awakening and sarcastic remarks, now felt muted, off-kilter. Elliot noticed it too. He stood outside Richard's door after lunch, holding a handful of freshly picked mint leaves. "You left this patch dry," he said through the wood. "We're trying to grow tomatoes, not toast them." No answer. He waited a moment longer, then walked away. Inside the room, Richard sat in his chair in the dark, curtains drawn, his journal closed and pushed aside. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. The offer he'd made to Elliot echoed like a mistake carved into stone. He had meant well, and still he'd failed. He had tried to give something big, but ended up offering something blind. He wasn't used to rejection. It stung more than he expected. He thought of all the years spent earning power, building walls made of wealth and credentials, and yet a child with muddy shoes had shattered them in a sentence. For the first time since the crash, Richard didn't feel strong in his survival. He felt small and truly broken. That evening, Grace finally entered the room. "I knocked twice," she said softly. "You didn't answer." "Didn't want to," Richard murmured. She placed a mug of chamomile tea on the side table. "You haven't eaten." "I'm not hungry." She didn't argue. Instead, she walked over and pulled the curtains open, letting the late sunlight pour in. Dust floated in golden streaks. Outside, the garden was alive with bees, birds, and a boy kneeling silently beside a patch of green. "Elliot's still out there," she said without turning. "He hasn't given up on you." "He should," Richard said. "Everyone else has." Grace's voice didn't rise. "He won't. Not because you're rich or important, but because he sees what you're trying to hide." Richard looked at her, surprised. "And what's that?" "That you're not afraid of failing," she said. "You're afraid of feeling." Her words were simple, but they cut deep. Later that night, after Grace had gone, Richard wheeled himself slowly out of the room. The house creaked under the weight of evening, the garden door was open, and the air smelled of earth and smoke from a distant chimney. He saw Elliot by the old bench under the sycamore tree, sketching in a worn notebook. Richard approached carefully. "Didn't mean to disappear," he said. Elliot didn't look up. "You did." Richard nodded. You were right. I was trying to fix things with money. It's the only thing I've ever been good at. Elliot closed his notebook and finally met his gaze. No, he said. You're good at hiding, but you don't have to be. Richard lowered himself onto the bench, awkwardly but with effort. I don't know how to be anything else. Elliot shrugged. Start there. It was quiet beneath the sycamore tree. Elliot didn't speak again, and Richard didn't push for words. They sat side by side as the last of the daylight faded into dusk, the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but earned. Richard had spent most of his life filling silences, talking over people, outsmarting opponents, overpowering arguments. But now, he was starting to understand that stillness held its own kind of power. The next morning, Richard woke early, not out of obligation, but by choice. He pulled himself into his wheelchair, opened the curtains, and let the light in without hesitation. The garden outside sparkled with dew. Life, simple and stubborn, continued without waiting for his approval. He found Elliot by the fence, adjusting the chicken coop door with a piece of string. "Need a hand?" Richard called out. Elliot looked up, surprised, but not shocked. "You know how to tie knots?" "Not really." "Perfect. You'll learn." And just like that, Richard spent the next hour watching, learning, fumbling, and finally succeeding in tying a loop that didn't immediately fall apart. It wasn't much, but it was a start. In the following days, their unspoken routine deepened. Elliot never ordered him around, but he suggested, nudged, invited. "Want to help pick blackberries? Can you reach the hose for the greenhouse? Mind checking if the eggs hatched?" None of it seemed important, but it was. Every task was a thread, slowly weaving Richard back into the fabric of human connection. One afternoon, Grace returned from town with a second-hand radio. "Thought you might like some music in the garden," she said, placing it beside Richard as he sat under the tree. He turned the dial until a soft jazz melody crackled through the speaker. He wasn't sure if it was the song or the sunshine or the scent of rosemary in the air, but something made his chest ache in the best possible way. "I used to hate silence," Richard admitted, mostly to himself. "Then why did you choose it for so long?" Elliot asked from behind him, rinsing his hands in a metal basin. Richard didn't answer immediately. "Because silence doesn't reject you," he finally said. "People do." Elliot dried his hands. "Maybe, but silence doesn't love you either." Richard closed his eyes. The words lingered. Later that evening, Richard wrote in his journal, "Today I tied a knot, watered basil, listened to music. Not one of those things will change the world, but for the first time I didn't feel like the world owed me anything. I just felt part of it." That night, instead of going straight to his room, he lingered in the hallway as Grace read aloud to Elliot in the kitchen, a children's novel filled with wonder and mischief. Richard leaned against the doorframe, unseen, listening. And for the first time in decades he felt safe, not because he had control, but because he was finally letting go of it. Autumn crept in slowly, draping the hills in shades of amber and rust. The garden began its quiet retreat, trading blooms for brittle leaves, but Richard didn't mind. The changes in the landscape mirrored something within himself, something soft, gradual, and hard to explain. He now joined Elliot most mornings without being asked. Sometimes they worked in silence, other times they shared stories, Richard speaking of boardrooms and Tokyo skyscrapers, Elliot speaking of tree houses and library corners. The difference in scale didn't seem to matter. There was truth in both. One morning, Richard noticed a flyer pinned to the community board in the village post office, a request for donations to help repair the roof of the local primary school. He took the paper without a word. That evening, Grace found an anonymous envelope in the donation box with enough money to fix the entire roof. No name, no return address, just a small note that read, "For the children who still believe in stories." Grace didn't mention it to Richard. She didn't need to, but Elliot did. "You don't have to hide it, you know," he said while planting garlic. "The things you do, people notice." Richard looked up from the compost bin. "That wasn't the point." "Exactly," Elliot said. "That's why it mattered." It was the first time Richard had given something without expecting anything in return. Not praise, not gratitude, not control. And it felt strangely right. He started giving more, quietly. A coat to the elderly neighbor, paint to the school's art room, books to the village library, donated under the name R.A. No one connected the initials. No one needed to. And for once, Richard didn't need to be known. He just needed to act. That week, he and Elliot fixed the broken bench beneath the sycamore tree. It had been there for generations, weathered and splintered, but still holding weight. Like people, Richard thought. Bent, but not broken. When they finished, Elliot brushed the dust off his palms and sat down beside him. "You've changed," the boy said. "I don't feel changed," Richard replied. "Doesn't mean it didn't happen." Richard smiled, looking out over the garden, now dotted with the last stubborn blooms of the season. "Why do you help me?" he asked. "Really?" Elliot shrugged. "Because you stopped pretending you didn't need it." Richard didn't respond, but he reached into his pocket and handed Elliot a folded paper. Inside, it was a sketch, drawn from memory, of the boy kneeling in the garden, planting that first daisy. "I drew it," Richard said, voice low. "I don't know if it's good." Elliot looked at the drawing, his face unreadable. "It doesn't have to be good," he said. "It just has to be true." Later that night, Grace found the drawing pinned to the kitchen wall. No one spoke about it, but everyone understood. The man who once built empires had finally learned the value of a quiet hand, one that gives, not to control, but to connect. It was Elliot's idea first. They were walking through the village one crisp morning when they passed the crumbling remains of an old tool shed beside the chapel. The roof sagged, and ivy clung desperately to the stone walls. Richard paused, his eyes catching on the skeleton of something once useful. "This place could be more," Elliot said. "More than a ruin, more than forgotten." It stuck with Richard all day. That night, he wrote in his journal, "Maybe places are like people. Broken doesn't mean worthless. It just means waiting for someone to care." By the end of the week, Richard had quietly arranged permits, spoken to the council, and funded the reconstruction of the building. But this time, he didn't call it an initiative or a project. He called it a gift. He asked for one thing only, that the center be named not after him, but after Edwin, Elliot's grandfather, a man Richard had never met but whom Elliot spoke of often with reverence. "Are you sure?" Grace asked when Richard told her. "Absolutely." She looked at him, her eyes glistening with something between gratitude and disbelief. "I wish Edwin had met you like this." Richard smiled softly. "I wish I had met me like this." The center became a village affair. People brought tools, spare timber, books, old chairs. Children helped paint the walls, choosing colors far brighter than Richard would have ever approved in his old life, but now found oddly beautiful. Elliot was everywhere, directing, carrying, laughing. His joy was infectious. Richard watched him from the shade of the sycamore tree, wondering how someone so young could carry so much light. The day of the opening arrived quietly, without ceremony. Richard had prepared a speech, short, humble, but when he approached Grace and Elliot, they gently shook their heads. "No speeches," Grace said with a smile. "Just presence." So Richard stood beside them as the ribbon was cut, not with scissors, but with Elliot's old spoon, still bent, still muddy. The village clapped and cheered, and Richard Ainsworth, for the first time in his life, didn't feel like the man in charge. He felt like the man included. Inside the center, shelves were filled with donated books. Tables held paper, markers, maps, old computers. A sign on the wall read, "A place to grow what schools sometimes forget. Hope, courage, and listening." Richard walked the space slowly, running his fingers over the wood, the paint, the chalkboards. Children buzzed around him. Volunteers served tea. Grace moved through the crowd with ease, laughter warming every corner. And then, at the far end of the room, Richard saw something that stopped him. Pinned to the wall was his sketch of Elliot in the garden. Below it, in small handwriting, "Even flowers grow in the hands of those who once forgot how." Richard sat down quietly, overwhelmed but peaceful. This wasn't legacy. This was redemption, and it had started with a daisy. The summer had faded. Mornings now began with mist curling over the hills, and evenings ended earlier, wrapped in layers of fog and the quiet hum of crickets. The garden, once bursting with colour, had mellowed into amber tones and dry stems, but Richard didn't mind the stillness. It no longer frightened him. He had learned to move through silence instead of resisting it. On the final morning of his stay, Richard sat beneath the sycamore tree, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching Elliot feed the chickens. The boy moved with ease, speaking softly to the birds as if they were old friends. The patched greenhouse behind him stood proud, crooked, and beautiful. Richard hadn't spoken yet. He was holding on to the moment. Soon he would return to London. Not to resume his former life, but to face it finally, with honesty. His companies had learned to run without him. Now he had to learn to live without needing them. Elliot walked over, a piece of toast in one hand, a stick in the other. "Draw something," he said, handing Richard the stick. "In the dirt?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "It's how you started here. Might as well end that way too." Richard chuckled. "Fair enough." He bent forward, carefully tracing a circle into the soil. Inside it he sketched a flower, simple, lopsided, but recognizable. "A daisy," Elliot said, pleased. Richard nodded. "It never really died, you know." "I noticed." They sat quietly for a while. Then Richard asked the question that had been resting on his tongue all morning. "Why didn't you take the offer?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the hills, thoughtful. "Because I didn't want to be somewhere impressive," he finally said. "I wanted to be somewhere true." Richard absorbed the answer slowly. It was so clear, so uncomplicated, and so completely opposite of everything he had once believed. "I'm going back to London," he said at last. Elliot nodded. "I figured, but I'll be back." "I know." Richard smiled. "You always know, don't you?" Elliot grinned. "Only the things that matter." That afternoon, as Richard's car waited by the front gate, Grace stood beside him, her hands clasped in front of her apron. She looked tired, but content. "You've done good things here," she said. "I didn't do it alone." "No," she agreed, "but you did it differently." He reached out and, to her surprise, hugged her, just briefly. "Thank you, Grace, for staying, for seeing me, even when I couldn't see myself." She smiled softly. "Some people just need time." Elliot ran up at the last moment, holding something in his hand, a smooth stone with a daisy drawn in charcoal across its surface. "For your window," he said. Richard took it, his throat tightening. "I'll keep it near the light." As the car pulled away, the house grew smaller in the mirror, but Richard didn't look back with sorrow. He didn't need to, because now he would return, not as a man in a chair, but as a man who finally knew how to stand. Back in London, the world hadn't changed. The streets still buzzed with urgency, deadlines still chased inboxes, and buildings still towered like monuments to ambition. But Richard Ainsworth had changed, and that made all the difference. He moved slower now, not because of the wheelchair, but because he chose to. He listened longer. He asked questions he never would have before, and when people rushed past him as if he didn't exist, he didn't take it personally. He simply smiled, because he had learned something the city hadn't. Silence speaks, and presence matters. His penthouse was the same, but different. The curtains were always open now. The windowsills held potted herbs from the Yorkshire garden, basil, rosemary, mint, and beside them, on a small wooden stand, sat a smooth stone with a hand-drawn daisy. He often found himself staring at it. On the days he felt old patterns creeping in, control, resentment, the urge to fix everything with money, he would trace the lines of the daisy with his fingertip, breathe deeply, and remember, some gifts are only given when you stop asking for them. The Edwin Learning Centre flourished in the village. Richard funded it quietly, still under the initials R.A., but he no longer watched from a distance. He returned every other month, sometimes unannounced, sometimes for a week at a time. He never brought staff, never arrived with an agenda. He simply came back. Grace continued her work, now part-time, splitting her hours between managing the centre's community kitchen and tutoring young mothers in literacy. She never stopped moving, never stopped giving. Elliot had grown taller, his voice deeper, his eyes no less sharp. He had started mentoring younger children at the centre, teaching them how to plant seeds and read stories and speak honestly, just as he once had with Richard. Each year on Elliot's birthday, Richard sent a letter. Never a gift, never a check, just words, real ones. Sometimes they were a memory, sometimes an apology, sometimes a drawing on plain paper, always signed with respect, R.A. He never expected replies, but once, on a cold March morning, an envelope arrived. Inside was a single sentence, written in Elliot's careful hand. "You planted hope. It grew." Richard sat in silence after reading it, not crying, just full. That day, he wheeled himself to his desk, opened his journal, and wrote, "I offered everything I had to be saved." And the boy asked for something no one ever had, obedience, not to him but to truth, to change, to peace. He didn't heal my legs, he healed what no surgeon could touch, my will to feel again. Outside, the city roared as usual, but inside his home, a daisy stood still in the light, a reminder that even the broken can bloom, if they dare to obey the part of themselves that still believes in something better. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours, leave a comment below. Tell us, have you ever met someone who changed your life without asking for anything in return? We'd love to hear your story. And if Richard's journey made you reflect on your own, don't forget to hit the like button and share this video with someone who might need a little hope today. If you enjoyed this emotional journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories we're preparing. Each one crafted to move, inspire, and remind us of what truly matters. And before you go, tell us in the comments, which country are you watching this from?